Welcome to another day of campaign combat in the presidential race. This afternoon, Hillary Clinton staged a rally beneath the faded sign of Trump Plaza, one of Donald Trump's shuttered hotel casinos in Atlantic City, where she laid out her case against Trump's business record. Later tonight, Trump has a rally in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Mark is now. We will talk about both of those events throughout the show. But first, a lot of focus today has turned to how the Republican Party and its presumptive nominee are responding to FBI's announcement yesterday that it would not recommend criminal charges against Clinton for her State Department email practices, coupled, of course, with FBI Director James Comey's wide-ranging and scathing takedown of Clinton's judgment and probity regarding those practices. The Trump campaign and the Republican National Committee both put out videos featuring Comey today, and in what is perhaps the quickest action to come out of Congress in many years. Comey is being called to testify before the House Oversight Committee tomorrow. Then next week, Attorney General Loretta Lynch will do the same. Today, at a Capitol Hill press conference, House Speaker Paul Ryan went so far as to say that Clinton should be banned from the national security briefings that presidential nominees traditionally receive when they become their party's standard bearers.
I was on the ticket in 2012. After the convention, you get the full, deep classified information as part of transition, as part of being a nominee. I think the DNI, Clapper, should deny Hillary Clinton access to classified information during this campaign, given how she so recklessly handled classified information. We have seen nothing but stonewalling and dishonesty from Secretary Clinton on this issue, and that means there are a lot more questions that need to be answered.
Mark, we will talk about Donald Trump momentarily, but first let's look just at Republican leaders. They have, as you know, bungled these kinds of inquiries before, over and over again, but most recently with the Benghazi matter. So politically speaking, in your view, what would it take for Republicans to succeed in prosecuting this case?
If they want to make this politically effective, they're going to have to perform significantly better than they did on Benghazi and in most other hearings that have had public policy and political motives. Look, in these cases like this, it's complicated, but you have to do what's right. Is there a public interest here? There is. What Comey did was controversial. What Clinton did was controversial. They need to find an area where there's actually a public interest. They need to do a fast investigation. Comey's got little time to prepare. They've got little time to prepare. And they have to figure out a way to make the public, and if they're lucky, some Democrats join in the questioning of, was this done in the public interest?
I will tell you that I think that on every level, theoretically speaking, a hearing by the House Oversight Committee with James Comey could be a useful exercise in theory, but a snap hearing called one day for the next day, given the way House Republicans have generally handled these matters when they've had months to prepare, millions of dollars to spend, given how well they've done on those kinds of inquiries in the past, the idea that they're going to conduct a useful hearing, either politically or in the public interest, on this short notice strikes me as highly implausible.
John Heilemann, you are right to be skeptical. I agree with you, and it's an interesting decision on their part to do it so quickly. But there are, as I said, a lot of questions. You know, Bernie Sanders is critical of Hillary Clinton's emails. He was today. I've not heard a single other Democrat raise any questions. And what Republicans, again, if they're going to be politically successful in undermining Comey's decision, in piggybacking off of Comey's statement in terms of his verbal indictment, they're going to have to find a way to get reporters to ask Democrats, which we should be doing anyway, what is it about what Hillary Clinton did that troubles you in the wake of what Comey said?
All right, let's move on. The Trump campaign is also naturally attempting to capitalize on the FBI's rebuke of Clinton and her email practices. But one of their biggest obstacles is, or at least might be, Donald J. Trump himself. Last night at his rally in Raleigh, North Carolina, where Mark was, Trump devoted portions of his speech to Comey's broadside and the lack of a recommendation of an indictment. But as Trump often does, he also wandered off message, and in some cases, way off message.
Hillary Clinton can't keep her emails safe. And you know what, folks? She sure as hell can't keep our country safe. Can't do it. We're talking about the safety of our people. The laws are very explicit. Stupidity is not a reason that you're going to be innocent. She went to extraordinary lengths to carry out an Enron-style purge of her emails. I think the one with the most to lose is Bernie Sanders. He just lost today the FBI primary. She's crooked Hillary. Don't you understand that? You know, we need unity in the Republican Party. We need real unity. And the leaders have to get supportive. And if they don't get supportive, we're going to win anyway. Don't worry about it. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, right? But you know what he did well? He killed terrorists. He did that so good. They didn't read him the rights. They didn't talk. They were a terrorist. It was over.
Okay, so Trump there, we just showed you some decent or pretty good, occasionally, little edited parts that are the attacks that were focused on the FBI decision. Those are all right. But he also made that comment about Saddam Hussein and a whole lot of other comments over the course of a 66-minute speech. And the Saddam thing has gotten as much, if not more, attention than the stuff that he said about Hillary and her email practices and Comey and all that stuff. So, Mark, my question for you at this hour, is Trump seizing this moment, politically speaking, or wasting a valuable, maybe even invaluable opportunity?
The good lines were good last night, and from listening to Trump and talking to some of his senior aides, I think they have a pretty good handle in uniting the Republican Party and in harvesting the best stuff from Comey to make this an issue. At the same time, his propensity to do things that the media and his critics pick up on is still there. Veep stakes is coming, the convention's coming. I don't know that Trump is going to be able to milk this forever, but with Comey tomorrow, with this story still alive, he would be better off, I think, making this more of a centerpiece. It's going to be fascinating when he gets here in just a little bit, how much he talks about Hillary Clinton, how honed he has that message. But I think that, that Trump's campaign has done a decent job, but could have done a better job on this.
Dude, your friend of mine, Nicole Wallace, this morning said, you know, this was a golden opportunity for Trump. All he had to do was get out there last night and talk for about 10 minutes on this one topic, essentially repeat what Comey had said in his preamble, and he could have scored a political home run. Instead, as I said, 66 minutes and this thing about Saddam Hussein, which isn't just something that the media or his critics, so-called, would seize on, but it's just an insane thing to say, an insane thing to be talking about, and totally detrimental to his own interests. So we'll wait and see what happens tonight. But last night, boy, given the ball that was placed on the tee and what he could have done with it and what he actually did with it, man, he really, I do not think he did very well last night at all.
Nicole's not here, but I hope she's watching when I say Nicole Wallace, of all people, who wrote a piece in the New York Times recently saying Trump isn't going to change. Stop waiting for him to change. Right. He's with no way he'd come out and do a focused 10 minutes. Again, I think they have a pretty good handle on the politics of this. They just need to execute it a little bit better for their own sake.
Well, he still should stop saying stupid stuff about Saddam Hussein if he knows what's good for him. Anyway, and like nearly everyone else in the political world, Hillary Clinton and her campaign talked about everything but her emails today. This morning, Clinton put out a college affordability plan that, among other changes, make in-state college tuition free for families making under $125,000 a year. And this afternoon, Clinton staged a rally next to, as I said before, one of Trump's shuttered casinos in Atlantic City. I was there. And she at that place denounced the Donald's business practices in a wide-ranging and thoroughgoing way. We'll talk more about Clinton's remarks later in the show. But, Mark, for right now, broadly speaking, how do you think the Clinton campaign is doing at this moment, handling the political fallout? Obviously, the legal situation, a total win for her yesterday, but the political fallout from what Comey said.
The Clinton team, made up of some veterans like Cheryl Mills, some relative newcomers like Brian Fallon, my hat are off to them. They know how to play scandal and controversy politics. They know where the vulnerabilities are. She's avoiding questions. I think they're going to wait and see how Comey does on the Hill tomorrow. But they've already gone after Chairman Chaffetz, who's running the hearing. They know how to play this game well, and they're playing it with a pretty weak hand, given what Comey said. I think 24 hours later, they're playing their hand really smartly, hardball politics, to try to neutralize the story as much as possible. But eventually Hillary Clinton's going to have to answer questions, and that's going to be uncomfortable and difficult.
You know, I'll tell you this, Mark, and this will delight you, because when I was in Atlantic City today, I was talking with your friend and mine, Jennifer Palmera, the communications director for the campaign, and she cited Haley Barbour. She didn't use Haley Barbour's name, but she said a Haley Barbourism. She said, you know what? One of the things I've learned in 20 years in presidential politics is that nothing's ever as good as it seems, and nothing's ever as bad as it seems. Yesterday, Comey's decision seemed like really good news for us, but I always knew there was going to be another tick of the clock, and we were going to have to deal with this negative stuff today. They are very even-keeled about it, and I agree with you. They are playing, in some ways, politically a weak hand, but they're very calm, cool, and collected about it. And they spoke to me today with great confidence about the fact that because of the way they were going to go after Chaffetz and what they think Comey is going to say tomorrow in that hearing, they think that they'll be better off by the end of tomorrow than they are today at this time. And
they were shot at,
composure,
and they weren't killed. And that's a great thing in politics and in life. It's nothing more exhilarating, I think the quote is. And they have now survived. And believe me, even if the Republicans in the House have a miracle tomorrow and they're totally ready for this hearing and they do a great job, they will be up against formidable adversaries. Team Clinton knows how to do this kind of politics.
And they know how to do it. They've demonstrated a lot better than those Republicans on Capitol Hill have in any of our recent memories. All right, some potential running mates for Donald J. Trump, billionaire, said thanks but no thanks today. We will tell you who after these words from our sponsors. Earlier today, before I got to the city of brotherly love here in Philadelphia, I was over in Atlantic City covering Hillary Clinton's takedown of Donald Trump's business record on the boardwalk. She spoke in front of the so-called Boardwalk Hall, which is just next door to the old Trump Plaza Casino and Hotel. She used that as a prop while describing Trump's real estate dealings and bankruptcies in Atlantic City.
Now, it is no secret that Atlantic City has gone through some tough times. And if your governor would start doing his job instead of following Donald Trump around holding his coat, maybe we could really get New Jersey's economy moving again. Donald Trump doesn't think going bankrupt is a big deal. but it's devastating if you're someone who plays by the rules. What he did here in Atlantic City is exactly what he will do if he wins in November. Step one, give a huge tax cut to millionaires like himself. Step two, add trillions to our national debt. Step three, he suggested we could just default on our national debt like he defaulted on his business debt. It is the same scam over and over again, and make no mistake, he's not asking for forgiveness. He's just hoping we forget.
Trump started defending himself even before Clinton spoke, putting the blame for his casino's troubles in Atlantic City on New Jersey elected officials. This morning, he tweeted, quote, "Even the once great Caesars is bankrupt in AC. Others to follow." Asked the Democrat City Council what happened to Atlantic City. Then, after Clinton's remarks, Trump continued his argument on Fox News, phoner style, and in some press releases and other places where he talked about how much money he made, even despite Clinton's critique. So, Mark, Clinton has attacked Trump for his business record in the past. Was this time any different or any more effective?
Well, look, it's going to be less potent because the Comey story is still taking up so much news bandwidth. Right now, there's a mismatch here. I'm talking about what is, not necessarily what ought to be. The press is hugely sympathetic to this storyline that Trump has hurt the little guy and the little gal in his business. There's a lot of stories that are factual. Trump is rebutting them in a sporadic way. There's not a full-throated effort, and there's never going to be from surrogates because this involves Trump's personal business, a la the Trump University stuff. So this is a very potent line. You'll hear more of it. Today's event, I think, is just a template, but this is one where I think the Trump campaign may be underestimating the degree to which the press will eat these stories up, and they need to be rebutted in some way, or Hillary Clinton will get some mileage out of them for sure.
So I was at this event. I'll tell you that the staging of it was very strong because of the faded signage of Trump Plaza behind her. The real life person who was supposed to be a victim of Trump's shady business dealings, his bankruptcy, was not that strong on stage. I'm not sure how much that will matter. The whole thing had a feel of George Herbert Walker Bush going to Boston Harbor to take on Mike Dukakis over not cleaning up the Boston Harbor back in 1988. Very effective kind of event, kind of a template for this kind of thing. I will say, to your point, I really think Trump put out a statement right after the event where he said, you know, he defended his use of the bankruptcy laws, again, said that's what they're there for, and then boasted about creating thousands of jobs and making a lot of money in Atlantic City. I think there's just something Romney-like about the kind of frame they can put on him, which is he's only in it for himself. He's not in it for you. That's a really devastating frame if they can make it stick.
I'm reluctant, unlike some of our colleagues, to say so-and-so's getting under so-and-so's skin. I think on this issue, it's clear that Donald Trump's sensitive about his business record, and Hillary Clinton personally knows that. Her campaign does. It's a real threat to him unless he figures out a way to push back with effectiveness.
Right. All right. Yesterday, Mark and I talked about the state of the Veep Stakes season, where things stood in both parties. Today, that state has changed a little. After spending the day with Donald Trump in North Carolina yesterday, Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, told the Washington Post today that he's withdrawing his name from VP consideration on Trump's ticket because he is, quote, not suited for the job of political attack dog. Iowa Senator Joni Ernst, who met with Trump over the weekend, also pretty much backed out. She told Politico that she'll try to help Trump win in November, but probably not. She wasn't definitive, but probably not as his number two. So, Mark, given those two big names just recently floated, now sort of deflated, where stands the Donald's VP decision?
Well, he told Fox today the list is up to 12, including 2 generals. That's a deviation from his previous position that he wanted someone who knew Washington well and could get legislation passed. So I don't have any idea. I continue to believe, as I've said now for the last few shows, I think as Trump teased today, there may be someone on the list, maybe someone who's been on all along, who they've got in their back pocket. I continue to be assured by senior Trump officials he will pick someone who is seen as unambiguously qualified to be president. And if he does that, I think it's a winning pick no matter who it is.
Right. Well, yes, that's certainly true. you made the point very well yesterday that it's sort of crazy that Trump's short list is now expanding. Even with people dropping out, like Bob Corker, the list still continues to grow. There's now 12 on it. The short list is getting longer, which is sort of nuts. And it's not just a kind of a funny point to make, right? It puts extraordinary pressure on A.B. Culverhouse, the head of his vetting team. If he's going to start introducing secret names, late-stage names, closer and closer to the deadline, it puts huge pressure on the vetters. We know what happened with Sarah Palin 8 years ago under those circumstances. Trump is courting that danger again.
Unless the whole thing is just a show, Trump is a master showman. He may have had someone in mind for a while, and he's doing things, growing the list, shrinking the list, floating different names to build up public interest. In general, campaigns like it. The difference is Trump doesn't need to sort of hype things. He'll get a lot of interest no matter what he does. So I'm not sure that this is a reassuring thing. But in the end, all the sound and fury of deep state speculation, it means nothing. The day he announces his pick, if it's somebody who's qualified, great for him. If it's not, look out.
Right, it's a problem. I agree with you. Look, I mean, there's something in my gut. I don't know what it is. I just think that Trump would love to shock the world. You know, he'd love to do the Muhammad Ali thing. You know, just shock the world, put somebody out there who no one was looking for. After he tweeted about people, touted people, floated all kinds of names, suddenly just someone that no one had been expecting. I think he would love that kind of a shock and awe kind of thing. And I don't know who it's going to be, but I think it could be someone like that. Anyway, coming up. We'll have the former U.S. Attorney General Alberto Gonzales to break down the FBI's recommendation in the Hillary Clinton investigation over her emails. Talk about all that with him when we come back. There has been a great deal of legal and political analysis regarding FBI Director James Comey and his agency's investigation into Hillary Clinton's email practices and their decision yesterday. Joining us now from Nashville to give his take, Alberto Gonzales, the former U.S. Attorney General under George W. Bush. Mr. Attorney General, good to have you. James Comey was your deputy when you were Attorney General. Just give us a quick assessment of him as a lawyer, an investigator, and in terms of his ethics and prudence.
Well, that's a lot there. I can't really speak to his investigative skills because obviously, as a Deputy Attorney General, that's not your job, is to do investigations. Your job is to make charging decisions and decisions relating to prosecutions. But listen, I know Jim is a hard worker, and I honor his service. He's obviously contributed most of his professional life in the service of this country.
Right. You don't have any sense that you never had any sense that that he has any kind of a political motivation in terms of how he handles his business as a lawyer, right?
No, but I think what's going on with respect to his press conference yesterday really relates to perhaps his judgment. And I was really surprised by the comment he made that no reasonable prosecutor would charge this case, because that is not his job, is to make that kind of assessment. His job as FBI director is to do an investigation and present the evidence to the prosecutors, in this case, ultimately the Attorney General of the United States. And I think by making that statement, what he's really doing is challenging anyone who disagrees with him and accusing them of being unreasonable. And so if the Attorney General of the United States decides that she wants to go ahead and prosecute this case, I think what he has said is that would be unreasonable, and I think that's unfortunate. And so that's the thing that really troubled me about yesterday's press conference. I can't speak as to whether or not Jim's judgment is right on the evidence, because I haven't examined the evidence. But that one statement really, I think, was really kind of interesting.
How unusual is it for someone in his position to make that kind of statement? I mean, I know you disagree with it, but do you consider it way outside of the norm in such a situation?
Yes. I mean, it's one thing. In fact, if I were the Attorney General and someone of Jim's experience was the FBI director and has done an investigation, I would quietly want to know, what do you think? Do you think there's enough here to charge? Right. But at the end of it, but that's something that would be a private conversation. For him to publicly say no reasonable prosecutor would charge this case really is an attempt, I think, to lock in the Attorney General. And I think it's very, very unfortunate.
All right, Alberto Gonzales, stay with us. We're going to keep this conversation going right after a quick break. And we're back with former U.S. Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. Mr. Attorney General, I know you've said that you don't want to say whether or not you would have thought, under the circumstances, knowing the limitations on what you know about the case, whether Hillary Clinton should have been indicted or not. But what more, given the thoroughness of his press conference yesterday, Mr. Comey's that is, what more would you need to know to reach a conclusion about whether or not an indictment was warranted?
Right. I would not make this decision based upon a 15-minute press conference. I'd like to sit down with the investigators. I would like to look at what they looked at. I would like to look at the precedent, other cases, and what the department has done in previous cases and the circumstances of those kinds of cases. So there would be a lot more work that I'd want to do to feel comfortable as to what I would do with this particular case, particularly because it involves someone who's running for president of the United States. You want to get this absolutely right. So, I'd be shooting off the cuff here if I just simply said, based on what he said, this is what I would do. I don't think that's right. Right.
Let me ask you this question. One of the things that Mr. Comey leaned in really hard on was the question of intent. He basically said, that she couldn't find criminal intent or intent on Hillary Clinton's part, and because of the lack of intent, it seemed to be a big part of why he wouldn't recommend an indictment. But there are those who point to the law and say that intent really isn't necessary here, that gross negligence is the standard under some of the applicable law. What do you understand the appropriate standard to be under the laws that govern in this matter?
Right. It's going to depend on the statute that's in question, and in some cases specific intent is required. In other cases it is not. For example, the standard of gross negligence wouldn't necessarily require a finding of specific intent. So it's going to depend upon the statutes that are being looked at. And what the Attorney General is going to be doing, or should be doing, from my perspective, is looking at those statutes and looking at the evidence presented by the FBI director and making her own independent judgment as to whether or not to move forward with the prosecution. She is not bound by anything Jim Comey said yesterday. She is not bound by his recommendation. Right. Her job, discharging her oath of office, is to look to see whether or not the evidence supports the indictment in this particular case.
Let me just ask you a political question. I mean, just from the standpoint of appearances, the decision of Director Comey to come forward with this decision and hold this press conference on the day that Hillary Clinton was first hitting the campaign trail with President Obama, that has come under some question from a variety of different sources. Just put us in the mind of James Comey. What would make the FBI director decide to do this on a day when he knew that event was happening with Secretary Clinton and President Obama later in the day? And do you think that was inappropriate?
Well, I don't think that affected his decision. Again, I don't know the factors that Mr. Comey weighed in deciding that yesterday was a day that he was going to make this announcement, quite frankly. What I find a little bit surprising and what is very unique is for the FBI director to have a public press conference and announce the findings of an investigation before even making a recommendation to the Attorney General, because I think he indicated that no one outside of himself knew what he was going to say, which tells me that he had not even told the Attorney General of his recommendation. That is very unusual for him to publicly inform the world. This is what my recommendation is going to be, without informing his boss. So that I find very unique and unusual, and I'd be very interested in terms of why he felt that he had to do that. But I can't think of a reason that why the announcement yesterday was in any way affected by the fact that Hillary Clinton was going to be campaigning with President Obama.
Right, but do you not think that, I mean, given that he knew that event was happening, I mean, would you say yes or no that it was maybe politically imprudent just because of some of the questions and suspicions it might raise? Was it not politically imprudent maybe to have it on that date?
No, it could be that Mr. Comey believed that he had made the decision. He knew what he was going to be recommending, and he wanted to get it out there as quickly as possible, as far away as possible from the convention, as far away as possible from the election. And it was simply a situation he was ready to go, and he wanted to make the announcement.
All right, Alberto Gonzales, thank you very much for doing this today, sir. When we come back, we will walk down the boardwalk and talk the board talk in Atlantic City, New Jersey, right after this.
one word, how would you describe Hillary Clinton?
Electable.
Strength.
Qualified.
Experienced.
Supportive. Brilliant.
Nice. Confident. Deceiving.
One word to describe Hillary Clinton.
Liar.
Fighter.
Woman.
Hypocrite.
Dishonest.
Smart. Fabulous.
Secretive. And Donald Trump?
He's very helpful.
Oh, he's persistent.
Unqualified.
Unelectable.
Straightforward. Fraud.
Truthful.
Bankruptcy. An opportunist.
Mess.
Stupid. Shifty.
Aggressive.
Brash.
Mean.
Arrogant.
Arrogant.
Douchebag. Joke.
Torn. I'm torn.
And Hillary Clinton.
Questionable.
How about Bernie Sanders?
Inspirational.
Some of the sights and sounds and opinions in Atlantic City today around Hillary Clinton's event. Not surprising, maybe they tilted a little bit more in her direction, but varied views. Joining us now to talk about Trump v. Clinton in Atlantic City, NBC News' Casey Hunt, who's covering Hillary Clinton today. And here in Cincinnati with me while we await Donald Trump, NBC's Katie Tur. Katie, the Comey hearing tomorrow is still getting a lot of attention. Obviously, the story will be alive for at least another day. How much is the Trump campaign focused on reacting to Comey, piggybacking on Comey, as compared to everything else they might want to talk about?
For them, they're actually focused pretty heavily on this. Today, they were supposed to release their convention speakers, but instead, Donald Trump said that they were going to focus entirely on Hillary Clinton's very bad
delay that announcement till tomorrow.
They decided to delay that, but at the same time, Donald Trump is still having to defend his business record in Atlantic City, sending out statements saying that filing for bankruptcy is normal and that he got out of Atlantic City at the right time. So he's still having to stray away from the message. Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, coming out with an op-ed saying that his father-in-law is not an anti-Semite. So as much as they do want to focus, as the RNC and the GOP is, on Hillary Clinton and Comey and this email scandal and the decision not to prosecute the recommendation, they're having a hard time maintaining it because Donald Trump is tripping over himself. Also, last night talking about Saddam Hussein and that becoming another major point of controversy today for the campaign.
Casey Hunt in Atlantic City. I know Hillary Clinton did answer questions on the rope line today. How are they approaching the Comey hearing, and what do they plan to do about eventually letting Hillary Clinton answer some of these things herself?
Well, Mark, I think that, we know how the Clinton campaign deals with these crises, right? It's set up, and we've seen them be pretty nimble in this setup, but it's a little bit of a bureaucracy. They're very careful and controlled. There are a lot of conference calls to figure out how to deal with all of these things. I think that there were conversations in the works about how Hillary Clinton should herself best respond to this. Then, of course, news came out today that Comey was going to testify. So it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to put her out there in the interim while this story is still going on, lest she contradicts herself again. As we've seen, those clips have been pretty brutal that have been circulating, showing, what Comey had to say about her emails and what she has until this point been saying as an explanation. Clearly, we're going to have to look for a new one, but at this point, it's not clear when that's going to come.
Casey, I'm going to stick with you. We were there today in Atlantic City together, and I know we were both talking to senior officials on the campaign. My sense is that they are not dreading the idea of James Comey going up to Capitol Hill tomorrow. What's your sense of how they greet the prospect of litigating this matter further on in a congressional oversight hearing?
I mean, my sense here is that overall there's a sense of relief that they're able to at least put this legal cloud behind them. And you also have to remember, she testified before the Benghazi committee on this and other issues related to that report for hours, and Republicans came out looking worse for wear. There is the risk that, this becomes overly political. And James Comey is a figure who's viewed as somebody of great integrity by both parties in Washington. So I do think that there is an element of risk for Republicans that the Clinton campaign is well aware of.
Katie Tur, I'm sitting here in Philadelphia, and I'm looking at a couple things in my email box. One of them is a story by Reed Epstein that's got a headline that says, "Anti-Donald Trump forces see convention coup as within reach." And another is an email from Tim Miller, anti-Trump leader, saying that noting that Trump's whip team told the Wall Street Journal today that he only has 890 committed delegates, well short of the 1,237 he needs to get the nomination on the first ballot. So what's the view right now in Trump's world about the Dump Trump movement?
Well, their view is that it is a movement that is going to ultimately be fruitless, and they believe that they do have the whip operation behind the scenes in place in order to maintain the nomination. That being said, it is a source of great frustration that there still are elements within the party that are refusing to embrace Donald Trump. He went out to Colorado last week to try and smooth things over with some people out there, certainly with donors. That didn't entirely work, so he still has a lot of efforts to go from there. But again, these controversies that he keeps getting himself into are what's hurting him at the convention, and it's what's giving these free delegate groups and various other anti-Trump groups, never Trump groups, the room to grow.
Casey, I want to ask you about Bernie Sanders, who you covered at great length. He spoke out today, said pretty negative things about Hillary Clinton regarding her emails, but positive things regarding higher ed. Where does the Clinton-Sanders relationship stand now?
I think that they are coming to a tenuous peace, and I think that all my indications are that there are discussions in the works for a potential endorsement event as early as next week in New Hampshire. They're still kind of hammering things out, and obviously things could change, but this is definitely viewed, particularly those income thresholds, starting at $80,000, but over the course of 10 years going up to $110,000, potentially above, for families who would be able to get this kind of assistance to send their kids to college. This is, the centerpiece in many ways, or at least a centerpiece of Bernie Sanders' platform and of his campaign. And it's something that Hillary Clinton had previously really criticized him for. She talked about how she doesn't want to pay to send Donald Trump's kids to college. She'd called this plan unaffordable. So this is a real, concrete policy concession to Bernie Sanders, and I think it reflects the fact that they have made some progress in recent days and could come all the way together potentially before the convention.
Katie Tur, let me ask you this question. We also had news from the Trump campaign today about their fundraising efforts. It looks like June was a much better month for the Trump campaign, raising over $50 million, I believe they said, for the month of June as opposed to the month of May when they raised virtually nothing. And yet at the same time, they have no advertising on the air anywhere and none planned. So you just explain that conundrum. The money's coming in, but it's not yet going out.
Yeah, well, they still have to fund basic operations in various battleground states that they have not yet been able to do because they haven't had the money to do it. So that is something that they're going to start trying to funnel money to behind the scenes. But if you ask the Trump campaign if they need ads, they're just going to point at this Facebook ad that they did last night on Hillary Clinton and Comey, this back and forth. That got over 6 million views. And while experts will tell you that those are people that want to seek out those videos, and those are already supporters of Donald Trump, most likely are not changing hearts and minds with that sort of thing. They believe that their social media messaging and their ability to drive a news cycle is enough. Will it be enough? No, they're going to have to start spending in some of these states, but I don't have any indication of when that's going to start happening.
All right, Katie Tur in Cincinnati with Mark Halperin, Casey Hunt in Atlantic City, more or less on her own. We wish you were here. Thank you both. Up next, we'll talk to former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell and former Cruz Campaign Communications Director Alice Stewart. And remember, if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back. Our final guest tonight is, in fact, two guests tonight. Ed Rendell, the former governor of Pennsylvania and a big-time Hillary Clinton supporter, joining us from Philadelphia in a location probably not very far from where I am now and out in Washington, D.C., former campaign communications director for Ted Cruz. That would be Alice Stewart. Alice, I'm going to start with you. I just asked Katie Tur about what seems to be a sudden renewed, at least a little bit of something going on with the Dump Trump movement headed to Cleveland. The Trump campaign acknowledging that their whip count, they're pretty far short of the number of pledged delegates they need to secure the nomination, and some anti-Trump people saying that they might be able to pull off a Trump coup. What do you make of all that?
That was to be expected as we got closer to the convention, without a doubt. There are some people that have had concerns with Donald Trump for quite some time and will continue to have concerns. And as we get closer to the convention, they're going to be speaking loud and clear. But what we expect to see at the convention, the RNC has gone through the rules process and gone over the rules. And what is expected to happen is people will galvanize and rally behind Donald Trump, and he will be nominated as the nominee for the Republican Party. While there's a lot of folks that are holding their nose and do have issues and are concerned about some of his policies and where he stands moving forward, the number one goal, the number one focus for all Republicans and conservatives is to defeat Hillary Clinton. And we cannot do it divided. We have to do it united. And the best way to do that is to get together at the convention, rally behind Donald Trump, and put all focus and all eyes on defeating Hillary Clinton.
Ed Rendell, I'm going to ask you about James Comey. Let's stipulate between you and me that Hillary Clinton not being indicted, as opposed to being indicted, was a good thing for her, and that it took away the largest threat to her nomination and her potential to be president of the United States. Having said that, the things that Director Comey said about her were brutal yesterday, and in some respects showed her to have been not totally honest. Some would say an outright liar with respect to some of the ways in which she handled her email over the course of the past year. How bad do you think the political fallout from the Comey statement yesterday is for her?
Well, I think the problem is, John, that Donald Trump blew a good opportunity yesterday when he derided the entire process as being rigged and implied that Director Comey was in on it and was somehow pressured to come up with the findings that he came up with. If he says it's rigged, it's very hard for him to then turn around and use Director Comey's words that were scathing in certain parts, against Hillary Clinton, because, Donald, you said it was rigged. So if it was rigged, this was all a mask to make it look good, so you could get to the eventual conclusion. So I think he boxed himself again by not taking a deep breath, forgetting about crooked Hillary, forgetting about she should have been indicted, and just say, look, this goes to judgment. This goes to care, that it's applied to serious matters. And, here's what Director Comey said. So I think he made a big mistake in handling what could be a very serious problem.
Ed, I'm going to ask Alice Stewart in a second about how Republicans have handled this, but let me just stick with you for one thing on Hillary Clinton. Given the things that Comey has said and the discrepancies between what he put forward yesterday and what she has claimed in the past, she's going to clearly have to talk about this at some point, right? Does she not have to, at some point, step forward and answer all of the many now questions that a lot of reporters would like to ask her after what Comey said yesterday?
Well, eventually she does, but I think it's not exactly clear what some of the facts are. For example, Director Comey said the reason he didn't bring charges was no reasonable prosecutor would, and because similar actions were never, people who did similar actions were never charged. Well, who are those people? That would be interesting to know, wouldn't it? He said that a lot of the emails had sensitive classified material, but was the email in its entirety classified? That would be interesting to know. I think there's a lot of fact-finding before anybody's in a position to answer questions. But sure, I can imagine in one of the 3 presidential debates, someone's going to ask Secretary Clinton those questions.
Well, it'd be awfully nice if she had a press conference. It'd be nice if she had a press conference before that. It's been a long time since she had one. It'd be nice for her to meet the press and take some of those questions sooner than the debate. Alice, let me ask you, as a communications professional and a longtime Republican, how do you think your party and its presumptive nominee has handled the potential political opportunity that James Comey has presented them with, the things that he said about Hillary Clinton yesterday? How well are they doing so far?
I think I agree somewhat with the governor there, and that there was more to focus on yesterday as opposed to the rigged system or the crooked Hillary. The sheer fact of the facts that Comey outlined, and that, yes, a large number of the emails that were sent through her personal server were marked classified at the time they were sent. And this flies absolutely in the face of her repeated, unequivocal denials that any of the emails that were sent were marked classified. So in and of itself, that fact alone, she obviously lied repeatedly to the press and to those that asked those questions. And I see it really hard for her to get through the next few months before we get to a debate, getting by Katie Tur and Hallie Jackson and the group of reporters that are out there on the ground without having to answer some of these questions. And that's going to be difficult for her to do. In addition to the fact that we have national security information that is, who knows who has access to this now. We don't know who has tapped into that system, and that's the question that may not be known for quite some time. So those are the kind of things that need to be pointed out, the fact that she lied repeatedly about this information, and just the sheer fact that she knew what the rules were. She knew what the rules regarding the use of the personal server, and she felt that the rules did not apply to her. And those are the kind of things that Republicans and the GOP needs to continue to hit on over the next few months.
All right. Alice, thanks very much. Ed, let me ask you one question real quick. Just 2 words. Who would be the best VP pick for Hillary Clinton right now? Just 2 words. A first name and a last name.
I like Tom Vilsack.
Tom Vilsack, all right. Some might say Ed Rendell. Certainly that would be an entertaining pick for all of us. We'd love to see Mr. Rendell on the ticket. Ed Rendell, Alice Stewart, great to see you both. Thanks for coming back on the show. We'll be right back. Check out BloombergPolitics.com for all of your 2016 news. Up next, tune into Bloomberg Radio for First Word Asia. And coming up on Bloomberg TV, the president of Udacity and the CEO of AOL. That's on Bloomberg West. Until now, for me here in Philadelphia and Mark Halperin out there in Cincinnati, we say to you, sayonara.
I'm Ramy Inocencio, and you're watching Bloomberg West. Let's start with a check of your Bloomberg First Word News. Tennessee Senator Bob Corker has taken himself out of consideration to be Donald Trump's vice presidential running mate. That move deprives the GOP establishment of a contender who would have added experience to the ticket. The Washington Post reported Corker informed Trump of his decision yesterday. And Iowa Senator Joni Ernst also appears to be dropping out of contention to be Trump's running mate. Politico reports the conservative star says she will still help Trump, just from the Senate. Meantime, Hillary Clinton is expanding her college cost plans. She's proposing to eliminate public in-state tuition for students whose families make less than $125,000 each year. That's according to an aide. She also wants a 3-month moratorium on federal student loan payments. Those proposals may be an attempt to appeal to Bernie Sanders supporters. And President Obama says U.S. troop withdrawals from Afghanistan will slow down. Take a listen.
Instead of going down to 5,500 troops by the end of this year, the United States will maintain approximately 8,400 troops in Afghanistan into next year through the end of my administration.
The president says security in Afghanistan remains, quote, precarious, and the Taliban is still a threat. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ramy Inocencio. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg West is next.
I'm Corey Johnson in for Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg West. Coming up, the titans of tech and media are back in Sun Valley. We'll dig the Idaho buzz and see which deals could result. Plus, another blow for Apple. The technology giant suffering another loss in its biggest overseas market. We'll find out what happened in China and who's taking a bite out of Apple's sales. And we'll take a deep dive into tech investing in China, where the latest trends, the IPO pulse, and what's next in M&A. Two all-star Chinese tech investors join us for an in-depth conversation. But first, to our lead. Forget winter, mergers are coming, or so says IAC Chairman Barry Diller. The former studio chief believes that the consolidation of the movie and TV business is coming, and also fears it will cause creativity to suffer. But CBS CEO Les Moonves thinks that recent deals make sense for both buyers and sellers. The executives, among many, attending the annual Allen & Company conference in Sun Valley, Idaho, with other industry titans. Bloomberg's David Gura, speaking of titans, joins us right now from Sun Valley. Dude, you've been killing it there. I've been to this conference a couple times. It's sort of amazing, the giant heads of business and really the media business and tech business who gather there.
Yeah, it's incredible. So yesterday, everybody arrived and they sort of pen us outside the lodge, which is a bit demeaning, but we watched as folks came in, and it really is a broad swath of people. So you do have executives from tech, executives from entertainment and media all coming together, and everyone that I've spoken with here says they tend to mingle very organically, and indeed, as we've been walking around the grounds today, you do see folks from tech, from entertainment, from media talking, going to get coffee, and we on the outside are left wondering sort of what they're talking about. But a few of them have been sharing sort of what they've been thinking about, what deals they're thinking of, at least in broad terms, Corey.
We're showing pictures of everyone from Michael Eisner to Jack Dorsey to Nick Woodhouse from GoPro. When these people are gathering here, there's certainly a lot of buzz in the air about a handful of deals that have been done. Certainly the business of providing content has never been hotter right now. But there's these looming giant epic moves here, not least of which what's going on with the Redstone family.
Yeah, really fascinating. So we were all waiting for Sherry Redstone to arrive last night. We were thinking, you know, what's this going to be like when Sherry Redstone gets here and Philippe Dumont, who's also on the invite list, get here? Would they have an interaction? Would we see that happen? We haven't seen Philippe Dumont at all, and nobody has confirmed for us that, in fact, he is here in Sun Valley. We've been asking folks who said they can't confirm that. Sherry Redstone, though, interestingly, Corey, has taken on a really outsized role here. Again, just walking the grounds, I've seen her several times today, sometimes alone, going to get coffee, but more often than not with other people. She was with Nicole Seligman, the former president of Sony Entertainment, Sony USA, now appointed to the Viacom board. She was with Howard Marks as well. We've seen her with Bob Iger last night on the way to dinner. Les Moonves gave her a ride. Les Moonves, of course, the head of CBS. So she's very prominent here. And again, we haven't seen Philippe Dumont, and that is really the biggest underlying drama here. There's a bit of drama surrounding Disney, of course. Tom Staggs, who is the heir apparent to Bob Iger, until as recently as a few months ago, did arrive last night with Ben Sherwood, another Disney executive. He's still on as an Iger advisor. They all got out of the same car. That was a bit, strangers like a small car, these three people getting out of this small car. But really, it's the Viacom drama that's been the biggest one here.
So it's like clowns that are out of a Volkswagen Beetle is what you're saying. So
It's like that, yeah.
they're not
American-made
clowns. These are powerful business people indeed. You talked about the demeaning nature. I want to ask you about that a little bit, because I don't know if it's demeaning, but reporters are separated from the people who actually do business. We don't, I don't think we should ever pretend that we are them and they are us, but there is a physical distance put on this way. Well, the reporters may gather, but they may not participate.
Yeah, as you've seen the footage here, there are places where we're allowed to film, places where we're allowed to shoot pictures, but that's very restricted. We're only allowed to approach, without our mics on, without our cameras on. And it's a very funny dynamic. I saw that Alex Sherman, our colleague at Bloomberg who covers M&A, suggested it's kind of like going to cover an NBA game from outside the arena, having no idea what's going on inside. So there are folks here who want to talk. Again, last night, as we gathered outside the front of the lodge, there were executives who wanted to come over, give us a sense of what they were hoping to talk about, what they thought they'd talk about. Obviously, there are big macro issues that are weighing on all these industries. The recent Brexit decision, the political contests coming up here in the U.S., and indeed, when you look at the program